It's great to have your company. You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. My name's Simon Smart.
And I'm Natasha Moore.
Well, this is a time when we are reminded every day on the news that religion matters to people, that it can not only be a force for great good, but a source of division, conflict and violence. In recent weeks, even those who are positive about religion and the religious impulse might be tempted to agree with the late Christopher Hitchens and say that religion poisons everything. But as with most headlines, life is much more complicated than that. Well, someone who is more aware than most of the complexities of life when it comes to religion and culture and politics is Ada Agazarian. Ada lives in the old city of Jerusalem, so her home is right at the heart of a place where religion and religious differences are conspicuously on display every day. Ada is in Australia with World Vision and the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Network, and she's in the studio to talk to us. Welcome, Ada.
Good to be here.
Now, Jerusalem is such a religious place. You must notice the enormous difference when you come to a place like Australia where serious religion is an alien thing to lots of people.
Yeah, that's true. And I guess the concept of religion is also different from one place to another. In many ways, the culture of religion takes over in a place like the old city of Jerusalem. And something that I've been telling to some friends here in Australia is that even the definition of religion changes. For instance, here, if you would identify as a Christian, people would assume that you actually go to church, you believe, you're a believer. But back home, when you say you're Christian, it could just mean that you were born to Christian parents. And people seldom even really care whether you do believe or not. One joke that we often say is that if you go to the Middle East and you say that you're an atheist, for instance, the first question you would be asked is whether you're a Christian atheist or a Muslim atheist or a Jewish atheist. Because what people are really interested in is not so much what you believe in, but what context you're in. And the politics and religion are very much interlinked together, depending on where you were born and to what religion you were born.
I imagine, Ada, I've never been, but I imagine that it must be hard to get away from religion in daily life in Jerusalem. It must be visible on the street all the time. You can tell just by looking, that people follow different religions. But do religious differences, do they actually form part of regular conversation? Do people talk about it?
Yeah, as you said, absolutely. I mean, people even dress in their own religion. It's very, very visible, even when walking. And as I said, it's not necessarily, again, saying something about that person's faith, but still the choice to be dressed in such codes that have to do with nationality as well. So even by walking in the streets, you would notice who's the Muslim, who's the Jew, who's the Christian. It goes with the attire itself. And it is probably, yes, part of the conversation because politics is always part of the conversation. And as I said, politics and religion are intermixed together. So for instance, your religion in a way would dictate what kind of papers you carry.
So is there much interaction and connection between people of different faiths, even friendship across those lines?
Probably on the superficial level, people do interact. I would say that Christians and Muslims are probably more connected in a certain sense because of the language. And this is also very important to have in mind, that Palestinians often would speak Arabic, whereas if you happen to be from an Israeli background, then Hebrew would be the more dominant question, even though it's also not as simple as that, for there are a lot of Jewish immigrants, for instance, who come from places like Russia and Ethiopia, and their language is different, but they would still be integrated within that Hebrew culture, whereas for a lot of Palestinians, Arabic would be the more dominant language, and hence relationships would be more solidified.
Yeah, I think we in the West assume it's complicated, but don't necessarily know how complicated it really is. I think it's easy for us to think of Israel in a very binary way, that people are either Jewish or they're Muslim. What's it like being a Christian in the midst of that?
That's the interesting thing. A lot of people in Australia have been surprised when I tell them I'm Palestinian, Armenian Christian, and they say, there's Christians in Palestine. And I would say, Jesus Christ, Bethlehem, does that ring a bell? Of course, there are different groups living in Jerusalem. It's not just certain groups. There have always, for instance, been Armenians living in Jerusalem. There are Copts, Assyrians, Ethiopians, different groups, different types of Muslims, different types of Jews and Christians. Christians. So this is something that is, I think, very important to know about a place like the Old City of Jerusalem, where there is the tendency to think that there are two groups. People often talk about the two sides, but I think that there's more to one side, to each side as well.
Now, I heard you say on radio recently that Jerusalem is a place of great spiritual depth, and it kind of pushes you onto a spiritual journey in a sense. But it also shows how religion, when it's intertwined with cultural and political identity, things like greed and power, it can become an ugly thing, can't it?
Yes, for sure, for sure. We often talk about the power of culture versus the culture of power, because in many ways this does show itself even in different groups and subgroups as well. For instance, even within the churches, there's a lot of sense of wanting to protect the church or possess, or, each person or each group wants to show that they also have a place in Jerusalem. So it becomes, even though it brings the best in people, probably the journey of spirituality, and Jerusalem is a very deep place to be in. People often think about the bigger issues when they're in a place like Jerusalem, the meaning of it all, and life and death and conflict and all of that. But at the same time, it sometimes does bring the worst as well, in terms of wanting to possess the place and take ownership and have to kind of take control of identity and be exclusive rather than inclusive.
Ada, of course, you're right in the middle, really, of the Arab-Israeli conflict, and that's, again, flared up terribly in recent times. What's it like living in the middle of that? Does that ever get normal?
It's somewhat simplistic to even talk about it as an Arab-Israeli conflict, because it's about the land of Palestine versus what's happening to that land in many ways. So to be caught up in this, what is especially tiresome is to think that your identity by itself is almost a threat to a new idea of a state that is going to take over, in a simplified way of trying to talk about it. So in a lot of ways, what's really distressing about this situation is that it doesn't really matter. As I said before, when you go to the Middle East, your identity doesn't really matter. Your personal reflections of what your religion is don't even matter in that conversation that wants to sort of impose on you what you could be and what you could never be. So in many ways, for instance, to be a Palestinian today is not a matter of choice. Your political affiliations don't even matter. Whether you're Christian or Muslim doesn't even matter anymore, because where you are born into at a certain point in history is what would dictate the rest of your life forever.
It's just a very foreign concept to us in the West. We're so big on personal autonomy and self-definition and that kind of thing, to imagine that, you're defined purely by your birth.
Yes, and I think it's also very relevant because even in a place like this, which I think in many ways, if I were to use the term West, even though I don't mean it in any bad way, but I mean the concept of the West in terms of respecting the individual, that's a great concept, I think. But in many ways, I think the West still looks at countries like the Middle East or the people of the Middle East in terms of general rather than individual. So I think it's very important perhaps to pass the message that there are individuals there. Not all Muslims think the same way, not all Christians in the Middle East think the same way. So I think that people don't really focus on that idea that there should be a respect of individuality in all parts of the world.
You're listening to Life and Faith from the Centre for Public Christianity. Our guest today is Ada Agazarian. She's here with World Vision and also with the Palestine-Israel Ecumenical Network.
What is it that you want people in Australia, in the West, to know about the conflict in your country?
I would say one of the things which is very important for Palestinians especially is to have interest in Palestinians and the stories of Palestinians. I often say that when people even visit the Holy Land, there's always this notion of it being a Holy Land pilgrimage, which is great. People want to go on this spiritual path and have an understanding of what it means. But it's also very important to actually meet with Palestinian Christians who live there, who are very much part of the place, and they have a connection with the land. So that is one thing that I try to make people realize, that when you do go to Palestine and visit Palestinians, you would often be thanked. people often thank you when you're there because it's like you acknowledge their existence and you try to understand perhaps their pain and see their struggle, look at them face to face and understand. That is something that a lot of Palestinians, from my observation, feel. They're very thankful when people even know. And of course, also in times of conflict, it is very important to have that sense of solidarity, international solidarity, as to what people are going through.
I suppose that idea of individual stories is really important as well. I mean, what we get on the news is always the generalities and it's always the negatives, the bad stories. But, there must be so many positive individual stories to tell as well.
Yes, and it's absolutely. And it's not just about the negative and the positive, but there's a different addition to it as well. Because often when people do talk about the conflict, they talk about it in terms of the politics. Is it one state, two state, and all of that, blah, blah. But then when you meet with the people, you realize that the way of living there isn't really much to do about the politics, rather about what does it mean to be in such a situation in terms of how does the conflict affect your papers and your access of movement and your education and your day-to-day life, even your relationships. So it kind of gives a different understanding to the conflict overall.
You often have this idea in Western secular cultures that the way to solve religious conflict is to really realise that all religions are basically the same and people should just look for what they have in common. Do you think that's a reasonable way to deal with the truth claims of different faiths, or, as opposed to learning to live with the real differences that exist?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, I'm sure that we could have a lot of different discussions about that. People might say this religion is different than that religion. This is not really my specialty. But what I do know is that going past religion, instead of focusing on this is my religion, this is your religion, and let's find a way to work things out because maybe we're the same after all. Rather than focusing on that, perhaps it would be more necessary to realize that we have individual needs, which in a way are the same needs. After all, everybody should have the right to access to education, to going from one place to another, to water, to services, and all of that. Basic human rights is what this goes. It is what this goes to. And when we talk about peace, it's very important to have in mind that sometimes it's simplistic to talk about peace when there is conflict, because by the end of the day, it should always be followed by another word, which is justice. When we start to talk about peace with justice, then we start to have a real conversation.
Ada, you're living with what look like intractable, particularly religious differences all the time. Do you hold out much hope for a peaceful coexistence between people of different faiths?
Yeah, I don't want to sound like a pessimist. Whenever people ask me about hope, I remind myself that it takes a lot of energy to live in a place of conflict. And personally, I go on this evaluation and reflection on a day-to-day level to make sure that I don't turn bitter. Because it's easy to turn bitter. And I often say that it's much easier to be a fanatic or fundamentalist in our part of the world. When you have all the answers figured out, or you think you have all the answers figured out in this self-righteous way, it's much easier. But if you're willing to be someone who's more understanding, then it's going to be much more difficult for you. I think the term coexistence has become simplified in the same way that the word peace has. I think at this point, unfortunately, we cannot talk about coexistence, because I often remind people that when we want Israelis and Palestinians, for instance, to get together and talk, what we have to remind ourselves is that Palestinians can no longer even be allowed to talk to Israelis because they can't even go there anymore. The only types of Israelis that the Palestinians see these days are either the soldiers or the settlers, both of whom are probably pointing their rifles at them. So we have reached this very difficult place. Probably in the 90s there would have been more hope, but right now we're looking at a very difficult image. And as long as we don't talk about that, the image itself and how it has gone so wrong, I don't believe that we can really go past it unless we really go back to the real issues that have to do with peace, with justice.
Well, Ada Agazarian, straight from the old city of Jerusalem, and giving us some wisdom on this complex situation for sure. It's been great having you in the studio to talk about it. Thank you.
It's good to be here.